everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Friday Show, presented this week by the Pegasus World Cup at Gulfstream Park. Tomorrow's big 12 race Pegasus World Cup day. It's a big day, Joe, and I did a little bit of research. You know, I do my own research now and then.
As one does.
You know, this is a day that was created 6 years ago. This is the sixth running, and it is a top 8 performer in terms of wagering, behind the 3 Triple Crown days, the Kentucky Oaks, the 2 Breeders' Cup days, and the Travers Stakes. They handle around $40 million, and for good reason. If you look at this 12-race card, average field size is 11 horses per race. It's just it's really it's a phenomenal card tomorrow. So thanks to them for the sponsorship. But we're here today, Joe. Something came up this week in the New York Racing Association hearing with trainer Bob Baffert. The phrase social license to operate was brought up by an expert witness on behalf of NYRA. I have to admit, I wasn't really familiar with this term until a few months ago at the University of Arizona Symposium. It came up in a discussion by Dr. Susan Stover from the University of California, Davis. And then we found out that Dr. Jennifer Durenberger spoke on this subject a few years ago at the U of A Symposium. So it's been around for a while, but I really don't know exactly what it is. What is it?
So social license to operate is, as Dr. Durenberger defined it during the 2019 symposium, societal consent to an activity that's generally considered to be outside the norm. And in modern times, horse racing is an activity that's kind of outside the norm. We're long past the days where, you know, horses are needed for travel. The horse and cart is gone. And as society, something that Durenberger pointed out, the average American is 4 generations removed from sort of the agricultural lifestyle where you use, you know, animals as, you know, farm equipment, as sort of partners in, you know, doing work or having your daily life beyond sort of companion animals compared to pets. You know, animals nowadays are seen as family, and most people don't derive income from family members as one does derive income from horse racing. So the social license to operate is the public's sort of unwritten permission to conduct your business and say, we're okay with this. It's not something that we normally do, but you are clearly enough of a benefit to society to keep doing this. And horse racing has run into a lot of pushback on this in recent years, especially since the breakdowns at Santa Anita in 2019.
Right. So there is no license hanging on the wall at a racetrack that says social license to operate. This is
correct. I've been looking over properties my entire life. I've never seen it, but I have seen what happens when it gets revoked. You could argue that dog racing had its social license to operate taken away, and that's, you know, it's something that people say, boy, we used to do that. You see it with the circus. They lost their sort of public perception, their social license to operate. Now it's a shell of itself. In the NYRA versus Baffert hearing, the industries of logging and forestry were brought up because they provide a service to, you know, the world. You need paper, you need wooden goods, but the effect on the climate is something that people have really taken notice to. And this is something that horse racing has run into. There are obvious financial benefits for greater society and within the industry itself. But, you know, if you're watching the show, you don't need to be reminded of all of the hits that horse racing reputation has taken. And in certain jurisdictions, certain states, certain countries where people have the ability to petition governments to perhaps outlaw horse racing, that social license to operate is starting to fail.
Yeah, I mean, when I hear you explain it, and I've done some research on it, when I hear the term, I think of public perception, which is something that I've been harping on about for a long time, but it actually goes one step further. It's not just what do people think of something that has a social license to operate, but they take action against it. They sign petitions. They do other things. You know, they support anti-racing things. If you listen to some of these regulatory calls with the public has a chance to comment, you hear a lot of these people. And there seems to be 2 schools of thought in racing, or maybe 3. One is ignore them. You're never going to make some people are never going to be happy with horse racing. The other is to try to work with them, to try to appease them, which I don't think does any good. And the third one is tell them where they can stick it, basically, and fight them at every chance. I'm not so sure that's that smart either. How do you, what's the strategy that racing needs to deal with this issue of keeping a social license to operate?
It's a battle to win the undecideds.
Okay.
There's going to be a certain amount of the population where whatever you do, they will support you. These are people who work within the business themselves, people who are diehard fans. There's going to be a certain amount of the population who is going to be dead set against you, no matter what concessions that you give, what changes that you make. And then there's going to be that sort of bell curve where it's the person in a non-racing state, for example, who has no skin in the game. But if they really like racing, they'll do something to defend it. And if they really don't, they'll sign the petitions. They'll go stand out on a street corner. Those are the people that you have to win with a lot of different sort of attack methods. There has to be education. There has to be, importantly, a willingness from the industry itself to improve itself. You can't just tell people where to stick it, because people don't like to be told where to stick it. You have to show signs that you're going to improve, and that's not necessarily concessions to animal rights groups, but a commitment to doing better, having a cleaner sport. I think those are two completely different conversations. Yeah. You take a look at something like football. Football, if you've ever seen the movie Concussion, if you've had any sort of discussion about football over the past decade, you're probably familiar with CTE, head injuries, the long-term effects that playing football can have on just turning your brain into mush. But that social license to operate with football is so strong because it's so strongly supported within so many different groups of people. Within the average person, their approval rating is high enough that there have been changes. The NFL has made changes themselves, but ultimately it's still a bunch of guys hitting themselves over the head repeatedly. The core sport hasn't really changed that much because there hasn't been enough of a pushback where it's in mortal danger of being taken away from places. Horse racing doesn't have that luxury. Yeah. We've seen horse racing lose its social license in certain states that have already lost racetracks, had them replaced with football stadiums. And I think that's something that really has to be fought on all fronts going forward.
I would suggest that football actually didn't, maintain the social license to operate simply because it's so popular. They did make a lot of changes. If you look at football today versus 10 years ago, you have the sideline tent for players that are injured. They go under the tent. They have concussion protocols. They've changed the rules on how you can hit. There's a lot of changes. There still are big people running really fast with an incredible concussion when they tackle one another, but they have tried to make some changes. I think you're saying racing better do the same thing.
Absolutely. And that brings me to another point that I want to bring up. You mentioned specifically the NFL, though football is a sport that's played from 5-year-olds from Pee Wee football up to and beyond the professional football leagues. And the NFL has made these changes, but have high schools necessarily made these changes? Have Pee Wee football made the same sort of concussion protocol changes? They don't necessarily have the funding to. They don't necessarily have the people who subscribe to those philosophies. And horse racing is very similar. There's a lot of changes from the top down that have happened. But I want to read you a quote here. This is from Australian researcher Julie Fielder, who said this in 2019. She was talking about horse sports in general. We're talking dressage, just sort of different riding sports, not necessarily racing, but it applies here. This can't just be about a list of rules to follow and not break at the risk of fines or disqualifications. We need a more holistic perspective, seeing good welfare principles coming from the competitive rider up rather than from the authority down. And I think this is a core problem with horse racing, is that compliance with rules cannot be a trickle-down system, because as we're seeing in any amount of court cases, I can rattle them off right now, the boots on the ground, we need that compliance, or else it's just a bunch of people making rules that aren't getting followed. That's something that I worry about from a group like HISA. How is it pronounced, Ray? Is it HISA or HISA? The authority, yes. Yeah. We can make all the rules we want, but if people are still brazenly not following them to the point where The biggest trainer in the country is openly admitting to having an overage, fighting it in court, and sure seeming like he thinks he's going to win it. What good is having the rules in the first place?
Yeah.
And that damages your social license to operate. If people think that these rules are in place, but what does it matter because nobody's following them anyway, why should I support this? And I've seen this in a lot of mainstream discussions on horse racing. I've heard a lot of the horses are drugged, the races are fixed, the trainers are crooked. And that's the battle that we're fighting right now. That's your social license to operate. Those people who don't have a skin in the game, but have their stance and are going to act with votes, are going to act with their pocketbooks. That's the battle that we have to fight. That's your social license to operate right there.
I think, what you're saying is we need trainers to buy into this. We need trainers to say, we've got to start doing the right thing because this game's not going to be around a lot longer if we don't. I just don't know that you're going to be able to do that. When you see what, this ruling that came out of New Jersey last week, it was first published, Wayne Potts running a horse at Monmouth Park for a claiming price. The state veterinarian wanted the horse to be taken off the track after the race and finished second by equine ambulance. The trainer told the assistant trainer, and happened to be the owner, listed owner, no, don't let him take it on the ambulance. Well, I don't know if it's because if it goes on the ambulance, a claim could be rescinded or voided, but there was a claim for the horse. And they did eventually, they did void the claim. But when you have people doing things like that, and maybe there's more to the story, but I'm gonna side with the stewards in this one. Maybe there's more to that story, but how do you convince people like that they need to change?
Isn't that the $1 million question? I think for some, it will be having firmer consequences for actions, and for some, it's going to be executing those consequences and having them stick with it. There's going to be some degree, if horse racing is truly to change, there's going to have to be some degree of people who are not allowed to compete in it because they just simply won't adhere to the rules. And there's going to have to be some who see that and realize, oh, that could happen to me, and not, oh, I can just fight this in court and appeal suspension and just appeal it over and over again until someone dies or goes broke. I think having that sort of firm enforcement and a clear sort of guideline of you do this, this happens, is the kind of thing that can regain public trust. Going back to football, if you jump off sides, you get a 5-yard penalty. Nobody sues over that. Everyone accepts that you get your 5-yard penalty, you go along, and you get along with your day. 5-yard penalty is much bigger than a year suspension, 30-day suspension, lifetime suspension. But that acceptance of what a rule is, what it does, and appeal process is important. But maybe we don't drag that out as much and get a finite answer for people, so they don't wonder why is this person who popped for something still racing a year after they got in trouble. It's about building public trust.
I've contended for a long time that the sport is only as strong as its weakest link. And we have a lot of weak links around the country. You could have New York and California and Maryland really doing their best, other states, so just say those three, really trying hard with new rules, with more things geared toward equine welfare, safety. But if you have other states that aren't doing their job, it pulls everybody down. And we have a lot of weak links right now. Having said that, the social license to operate is not really necessarily a national thing. Is it state by state? Because I think the social license to operate in a state like Arkansas may be different than a state like California.
100%. The social license to operate can be as much of a cultural thing as anything else. Another sort of animal-related industry that has been brought into this conversation is rodeo. Rodeo is obviously much bigger in Western states, in the Intermountain region, places where you would think a cowboy would be. And, not so much perhaps on the coast or elsewhere, but they've gone through the proper changes and maintain a somewhat mainstream presence. The Professional Bull Riders Tour goes around the country. The National Finals Rodeo brings a lot of attention. But ultimately, if you want to go see a rodeo on a Saturday night, it's going to be a more localized thing. And I think horse racing runs into something very similar, where cultures, states, regions where working with animals directly hands-on is more common widely accepted, I think is going to be easier to maintain that social license in somewhere that you're not necessarily touching a horse every day or will come in contact with horses, and they're seen more as pets as opposed to either co-workers or commodities to work with.
The rodeo was addressing these issues in the early 90s, I think, because they were really, I think they were the first group that was, a target of the animal rights groups, and they've pulled through this. Dog racing has not.
Yes, and that's something that I want to touch off on too. In Dr. Durenberger's presentation, she quoted Bernie Rollin, who is an animal ethicist at Colorado State University, who said the social license is a rule of that is that businesses and professions must stay in accord with social ethics or risk losing their autonomy. And that's something that I think is pretty important here, because that means you kind of have to play along. You have to give a little bit, or else they'll take everything. With dog racing, they saw what happens when they take everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I bring up Michigan a lot in here, but Michigan lost its social license to operate, and they've taken everything. That was more on the economy side than I think the animal rights side, but that's something that's very important to bring to the table as well, is that this isn't strictly an animal rights issue. Sometimes it comes into what other factors are at play. Who else is trying to get in the way of horse racing in a particular community?
Well, in the case of Naira versus Bob Baffert, the attorneys for Baffert seem to poo-poo the whole thing, but they're trying to win a case. They're not trying to save the industry. They're just trying to win a case. But I would hope that that they do understand that this social license to operate, even though it's not something you put on a frame and hang it on the wall, it is real.
Absolutely. And that's something that I'm curious to ask you, Ray. We have several major profile cases that are plate spinning right now. In a case like Naira versus Baffert, what is on the line for the social license to operate should Naira prevail, and should Naira lose in this case?
It's almost a no-win situation for horse racing, I think, because Medina Stewart did test positive. No matter how the drug got into his system, he did test positive, and then he died. And the damage has been done from both of those factors. If he gets off, there will be an outrage, and if he is suspended, there will be the outcry that the most famous person in horse racing is a bad guy. And I don't think the industry wins no matter what the outcome is.
I think I'm on the same page with you here. Going sort of with what I mentioned before, with sort of the trickle up system, it's if you can make rules and you can beat them, that really it shakes the foundation of the sport. And this is a different situation. The Naira case is sort of based on they argue it themselves. They're trying to suspend him based on the social license as much as any individual violation. So I think that's worth keeping an eye on.
In the case of the federal anti-doping indictments, the trial that's currently ongoing with Seth Fishman, and we had Navarro plead guilty, get 5 years in jail. We got Jason Service on deck. We don't know if there's going to be another round of indictments or more. In this case, too, the damage is done. There is a recoverable aspect to this, I think, and that's just sort of the fortunate timing that we have HISA, the authority, however you want to say it, formulating its plan. They're not going to be ready by July 1st to do their anti-doping segment, but I think perhaps they will be ready for the safety part of horse racing integrity and safety authority. So if they react properly, I think we can, kind of like what football did, I think we can come out of this in decent shape if they do the right thing. They put together a strong enforcement apparatus, not just drug testing, but investigations. And Barry Irwin pointed out in the commentary this week in the Pog Report that the third leg on that stool is education. You have to educate people why it's important to do the right thing.
Yes. And that goes back to winning the undecideds, as we discussed earlier. Education is going to be key in that. One of the things that Dr. Durenberger really hammered home during her presentation was that people in horse racing have to have that elevator speech ready. Because, I mean, if you mention I work in horse racing, people usually have a list of about 3 questions that they're going to ask you.
Yeah.
And usually it involves, oh, what is trainer X doing? What is person X doing? That it's not going to be, what'd you think of that great Kentucky Derby? It's going to be, oh my God, what happened with X? And you have to be able to prepare to defend that and educate someone that's willing to be educated. If you happen to catch someone in that 60% in the middle, it's your opportunity, person by person.
The one thing I'll add on this is that when Dr. Stover did her presentation at Tucson at the University of Arizona Symposium this past December, she talked about the big data that they're undertaking, a lot of data, and she thinks that the use of the data, the cooperation of the tracks, which is mandated in putting together the data, will go a long way toward maintaining that social license to operate. So time will tell. They've got big plans at the authority for the data, and that's part of their strategy to maintain that license.
Mm-hmm. One more thing that I want to hammer home before we wrap things up here, just one more thing from the Durenberger presentation, because this was really good. Like this, if you can find this online, it's worth reading just to kind of grasp what's at stake here. She sees the social license as a 3-legged stool: legitimacy, credibility, and trust. These are the things that you have to win over from a group of people, an individual person, to maintain that license. And all of those are subject to perception. Yeah. You have to keep people with a positive, ideal of racing to keep that social license, because if you don't, you might not have racing much longer.
Yeah. Well, Joe, thanks so much. That's it's an intriguing subject to talk about. And we've got a social license to operate this weekend. That's at Gulfstream Park. The Pegasus World Cup gets underway at 11:30. A huge day of stakes races. Who do you like in the big race between, I don't know, there's 9 horses in there. There's a couple that might stand out. Which one of those 2 is going to win?
It's tough. It's a coin flip, but I'm going to go with Nick's Go on this. We know he can win this particular race under these particular conditions. I'm always a little wary of the future stallion prospect spends time at the farm, at the stud farm, to show before going back to the races angle. But Nick's Go has done nothing since this summer to deter from the fact that he's the best horse in training. He's a proven commodity in these exact situations. Assuming he can get the Best of Life is Good, who's the other major contender there, I think he goes out on top.
Well, I'm going with Life is Good. I thought his dirt mile was just incredible. He looked fantastic. If he looks anything like he did Breeders' Cup Day in terms of just his flesh, and he was primed as good as a horse could be primed that day. And I think he's going to outrun Nick's Go early and just keep on going.
He's a freak athlete. I think Nick's Go is your winner, but I think Life is Good is going to make it a very big fight.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's edition of the Friday Show. Joe, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.